Well, shoot, I guess we went live without the go live button that I expected on the YouTube. They've changed the studio again on me. So anyway, welcome to an episode of Lessons from the Dragon's Library. We're in the new battle station. Let me tweet out real quick because I did not expect it to just jump to live. Again, things have changed. And I want to check and make sure I've got everything set up correctly. So apologies for this first little bit of intro. I was actually going to do this ahead of time. I wanted to make sure the sound came through, so I got that. All right, so they have changed all of this on me again. Anyway, so welcome to another episode of Lessons from the Dragon's Library. Like I told you, this is the sort of podcast show where I talk about writing, story structure, my process. I answer questions. I do take topics from my followers on Twitter, and I need to figure out how to get my glasses not to glare on the screen, but unfortunately I'm getting older and my ability to read what I'm showing you guys is decreasing. So anyway, I want this to be an interactive show. So if you guys have questions while I'm talking, or if you want me to go over something again, or you just don't like the topic or whatever it is, just let me know if you have any questions in the chat. Or if you're watching the recording, come back, drop a comment in the comments for the video, or hit me up on Twitter. All the links are in the video description below. And as with all of my videos, the only ad you're going to hear or see is check out thebeardstruggle.com. That's where I get my beard products. So if you need wash and conditioner, beard balm, whatever you need, they've got it at thebeardstruggle.com. If you use BeardWizard99 as your coupon code, you're going to save 15%. So that's it for the commercials. We're going to jump into the topic. So I recently saw an article and read an article that Polygon had put out. I'm just double checking that you guys don't have any questions popping off right here in the Twitters or Facebook. And apologies for the mess behind me. I'm still getting the office all sorted out after getting the new computer built and everything. So anyway, read this new article on Polygon about how games, and I know we're going to talk about video games for a minute, but video games have story just as much as a book does or anything else. About how games need more morally or less morally gray stories and characters, and need to go back to a more black and white sort of game structure or story structure. And I wanted to bring that's a good topic for writing, because it is a constant source of debate and discussion online about whether it's good to have morally gray villains, a morally gray story, or whether it's better to just go to the very strict black and white sort of hero's tale, where good versus evil and all of that other stuff. But what really struck me is, I think, especially with this article on Polygon about morally gray characters and story, is that I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about story structure when it comes to what a morally gray character is, what a morally gray villain is, versus a villain who has a purpose or a reason for existing. One of the things that this article called out was that black and white stories where it's just good versus evil, the hero saves the day from the bad guy who's just bad because he's bad. They said that that's more common in like children's games like Mario, or it's more common in older games like Metroid. And while that's true, I would like to point out that there's another thing that those games that were very black and white in their story had, was that the stories are either extremely simple or extremely non-existent. I mean, you go from a game like, say, Pong or Breakout or Tetris, non-existent stories. So obviously those are going to fall completely out of the category that we're talking about today. But as far as is games like Mario, Metroid, Sonic, all of these old games. Sure, they had an underlying story. Let's be completely honest here. Mario, the Mario games do not really have that much of a story. You know, the princess is captured by Bowser, Mario, Luigi, or a group of them, depending on which game you're playing, go and save the princess. That's the extent of the story. There's no decision making in those games. There's no multipathing story structure. There's no plot lines. There's no red herrings. There is no subplot. There is no it's the most basic simplistic story that there is. And if you want to argue that there should be more games with simple stories or more games with less complex or less engaging story, you can make that argument. There are a lot of games out there still today that have very limited or very simple stories, and there's nothing wrong with that. A platformer whose only purpose is to test your hand-eye coordination and your timing and your ability to press buttons at the right time and get over obstacles and problem solve, those games don't need a very detailed or complex story. The purpose of those games is to give you a bit of an entertainment and a mind-engaging, eye and hand-engaging experience that does not need you to make decisions based on, you know, what a character would do or based on what another character says to you or anything like that. So to judge those games as being black and white story-wise and being better because of it is kind of a fallacy, because the fact that they just have a very simplistic story. So what I really want to talk about is for your novel writing, or even not necessarily novels, but short stories, comic books, video games. There's a lot of different avenues now for writers that complex story is just simply the existence of a plot that is more than linear, that is more than simple, that is more than, you know, the hero wakes up, goes from point A to point B, saves the day. You know, you can write that story. That story's been written before, but I would argue that that story has never been good. And that story rarely holds out over time. It's much easier to write a short story. Say you've got a 500-word flash fiction. You're not going to be able to work subplot in there. You're not going to be able to work a lot of character development into that. So you could very easily take a very short flash fiction or short story, maybe even up to a novelette in a very linear black and white good versus evil sort of way and be successful at it. But I think once you get into the extent of, say, a long-running comic book series or a 60 or 80 hour video game story or a novel or a series of novels, you're not going to carry those very far if you try to go for the very simple black and white good versus evil storyline. At some point you're gonna run out of reasons to put words on the paper. If all of your characters are very cut and dry, if your hero is very perfect and is just out there to save the world, and your villain is basically walking around with a neon sign over his head that says evil, you lose all the opportunity for character development between those two main characters of your story. Because let's face it, your protagonist, while your main character, but if you have a good versus evil story, your villain in that story is also going to be a main character. They're going to be in it for a good portion of the time. Obviously, your hero can't overcome the villain in the first chapter. You don't have a book. So to keep your readers interested and wanting to know more, you're going to have to put in that character development. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up is I think the misunderstanding I didn't take a lot of notes. I wanted to sort of run this off the cuff. So I'm looking at this, and I may modify this a little bit as I talk, but it's almost like we've got 3 layers of things going on here. You have story, right? Your story is here. And in your story, you have different characters. Obviously, unless you're writing a very singular, one-sided thing, you're going to have multiple characters under that story. You can have a black and white good versus evil story while also having morally gray characters, and vice versa. You can have a very morally gray story that has very black and white, two-dimensional characters. It's possible to do both. It depends on whether you're writing, like we talked about in one of our previous shows, what type of story are you telling? Are you telling a character-driven story, or are you telling sort of a milieu story where it's all about the environment? Or are you doing an idea story where the story is about an idea or a concept that you're going to turn on its head as you tell the story? Your level of complexity with the characters or the story is going to vary on the type of story you're telling. So let's say you're doing a character-driven story. It's all about the characters. Now, saying a villain, and this is one of the things that the Polygon article proposed, was that villains or bad guys who aren't bad just to be bad are morally gray, and we have too many of those. That was sort of the premise of this article, or part of this article anyway. And I would argue, and I would caution writers about this, that a villain who is sympathetic is not morally gray. They're still evil. Darth Vader, let's take a perfectly good example. There is no question in anyone's mind that Darth Vader is an evil person, that Darth Vader is the villain of the original Star Wars trilogy, and that Darth Vader is a sympathetic character. Now, not as sympathetic a character in most of the original trilogy, where you don't know anything about his background. You just know he's the dark guy in the black suit who does bad things. But as his character is developed and evolved, he becomes a sympathetic villain. It doesn't mean you like him, and it doesn't mean you agree with what he's doing, but it does mean you understand why. And that's the difference there. Understanding why a villain is the way they are does not make them a morally gray character, and it also does not make you empathetic to them, or I should say sympathetic to them, in the sense that you feel bad for them. You don't have to feel bad for the villain to understand them, to empathize with why. Taking our example, Darth Vader, we learn over the course of his whole story that he becomes the way he is because he becomes disillusioned with the Jedi Order. He slowly begins to realize that corruption and complacency has turned the Jedi Order into something that it no longer resembles the force of good and justice in the galaxy. He becomes swayed by the dark side. He becomes influenced by dark forces. He becomes tempted by this evil force in the universe. So you begin to understand. You still don't like what he has become. You still don't think that he might not be a bad guy. And that's the premise in the Polygon article, was that, bad guys that you don't know are bad, or they might be kind of good. No, the villains in your story, even if it's a morally gray story with morally gray characters, does not mean that the bad guy's not bad. Your villain's still a bad guy. And I think too often now, and that part of it is this culture of, you see it out there. Well, if you understand or if you empathize with the villain, then you must be bad too. If you like the Empire, then you must be a Nazi. Or if you associate yourself with House Slytherin, then you must be a bad guy too. Like, that culture, I think, has poisoned people's understanding of empathy in understanding the villain. And then that's starting to drive people away from wanting to do that. And quite honestly, think about it. And I'll give you some time. And if you do come up with any, drop them in the comments. I want to hear it. Can you think of any memorable villain that wasn't a mindless, zombie or an animal? Can you think of any villain out there that did not have a reason for existing, a reason for being on the screen or on the page, to be set against your protagonist. And I know there's some out there that are, but I want you to give me good ones that you remember, ones that sit on the top of, pop culture's list of memorable and good villains. I'm sure we can pull out from horrible books and horrible movies or TV shows villains that were just terrible villains. They're out there because there are terrible writers out there. And there are terrible writers out there that get their stuff published or filmed or put out there. So it's easy to find them, but I want you to find me good ones. Think of the ones that everybody thinks of. Darth Vader. Who's one of the best villains in pop culture history? Darth Vader, right? Khan from Star Trek. Man, my mind is going broke here. I'm starting to think of from Dragonlance, the Emperor from the Dragonlance Chronicles, whose name just is Ariakis. From Game of Thrones, Cersei Lannister. Going back to Hannibal Lecter, as vile and evil as that person is. All of the memorable villains in pop culture and stories and movies and television shows and comic books, Magneto from comic books, Lex Luthor, they all have a reason for existing. And then if you think about the bad ones, like one of the best examples that always springs to mind to me is the Marvel Comics universe, MCU. I did not feel that the MCU had a memorable villain until Vulture. Because it seemed like in every movie, the villain's only purpose for existing was to give the heroes somebody to fight. They didn't have a reason for being there other than either I'm taking over the world, or I'm trying to hurt a bunch of people, or I just need to be here because Captain America needs somebody to punch in the face. Until the Vulture, they were all forgettable, mediocre villains who really could have not been in the movie or could have been replaced with any other villain and still worked. And that's kind of where you have to base when you're writing. Is your villain, does he exist in this world or in this story or in this part or in this wherever for a reason other than to give your hero somebody to kick around? They've got to be there. And on the flip side, morally gray heroes, which we're going to get to in a minute. So the Polygon article proposes that we need more black and white villains or black and white stories, because the only times black and white stories exist are in children's games. And I propose that's completely false and misunderstanding of the difference between a black and white story and a simple story and a morally gray story versus a complex story. I think they're confusing those two things, and then putting it out there in a very long article that people are talking about on Twitter. So on the flip side of your morally gray / evil villains is your heroes. Not every hero is a paladin. Not every hero is Superman. And sometimes even Superman's not Superman. In Superman 2, the old Christopher Reeve Superman, he wasn't Superman for a while. He was definitely morally gray. But he was still the hero. He was still your protagonist, and you still knew he was the good guy. So there should never be a confusion that your good guy is the good guy, that your protagonist is the protagonist. Now, can you write a perfectly unflawed hero to be the white hat in your story, to be the white to your black villain, not black as in race, but obviously in this, ethical, moral discussion of black versus white, good versus evil? yes, you can write a Superman or a Lone Ranger or a Captain America character, but it only goes so far if you don't throw in a Superman too. Even Superman in the comics, even in his heyday, was not necessarily the paladin. He was not necessarily the perfect hero. The Lone Ranger wasn't the perfect hero. You know, Captain America still had his faults. So while they had very strict morals and rules that they followed, there were times that they faltered because nobody's perfect. To say that they are, or to say we can write more stories with perfect heroes, I think is flawed, because your character's not going to be believable and they're not going to be interesting. Right now I'm writing a story, and I'm struggling with this because I have a story based on a character where she doesn't feel fear. But that is not very realistic. There has to be something that scares a person. And so I struggle with that sometimes, because I still want that element of her. She doesn't feel fear because she has a very concrete faith in her goddess that nothing will happen to her unless it's supposed to happen to her. It's a very secure belief that if life is about to present her with the, death or dismemberment or pain or whatever, that it is meant to be. And otherwise, it's not going to happen. So she doesn't have any fear, but she has fear for her friends being hurt or her friends dying. So you can't write a character that has no flaws like that. You can't write a perfect hero unless you're writing a simple story like Mario versus Bowser. That's a very simple, very simplistic story, and I would caution anybody who thinks we need more black and white stories to not confuse that with we need more simplistic stories. Because a simplistic story, think about the Mario game. Why does anybody talk about the story? I mean, other than people that complain about the, princess being captured by Bowser in a tower thing, you're not hearing many gamers talk about how awesome the story in Super Mario Brothers was. They're not. They're talking about how difficult it was to beat certain levels, or how fast you could run through these, using the warp tubes, or how, you could beat certain things within certain time limits, or speed running. Nobody's sitting back there and dissecting the story of Super Mario Brothers, except for people who finding reasons to be offended by the story of Super Mario Brothers, which is a simplistic, very black and white story. So I would argue that the idea that we need more black and white stories is flawed in that their examples are not black and white stories. They are only in that they are super simple. So it's easy to do that. So then you have to determine, is your story or your characters or both going to be black and white or morally gray? So you can have a black and white story, good versus evil. The story is all about good triumphing over evil, evil eating itself and being so flawed that it fails, and good overcoming that. Let's take Star Wars. Star Wars has always been, and hopefully will always be, a story about good versus evil. It is about, in the original trilogy, let's go right back there. It's about the rebellion versus the Empire, the Force versus the dark side. The story is very black and white. There is no moral gray area to the story. The rebels aren't going around discussing how it might be okay if we hurt some innocent people to defeat the Empire. That's not ever a debate or a philosophy in the original trilogy, right? It's a very black and white story with very morally gray characters. So Luke Skywalker, your hero, he's not perfect. There are times when Luke Skywalker questions what he's doing. There are times when right when we meet him, he is very much excited about going off to war. He's not thinking about the consequences of war. He wants to join, the academy and become a pilot, which means he'll have to kill people and fight a battle and destroy things. Very morally gray concept. He's not thinking early on that he wants to go save the universe. He just wants to become a pilot, and he wants to shoot other pilots down. And I mean, that's a very morally gray concept. You know, when we get into Empire, he has dealings with Jabba, and he makes, you know, a bargain with a criminal. Now, a perfect hero, you're not going to see Superman. Superman's not going to stroll into Jabba's palace and make a deal with Jabba to save his friend. He's going to go kicking down the door, and he's going to throw everybody down, and he's going to use his powers to dominate the scene and take his friends back, because that's what your perfect hero does. He doesn't make bargains with the bad guys. That's not your perfect hero. So Luke Skywalker is a very morally gray, and I would also say light gray. I mean, he is a hero, and he's a very good person, but he's also a very morally gray character. And on the other side of that, you have Vader, who is the bad guy. He's an evil villain. He's a dark side user, a Sith Lord. He kills people. He doesn't care. But at the end of the trilogy, he turns. He turns and he throws his master down a chute to save his son. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. And we find out later on that there are very real reasons for Vader to be the way he is. So while you have a very black and white story, you have very morally gray characters. And all the characters in between. Han Solo, obviously morally gray. Boba Fett, also on the other side, like morally dark gray, but still, Boba Fett's a very pragmatic character. He's not evil. He has a job, and he doesn't necessarily care what that job makes him do, but he does it for materialistic gain. He's not out there killing people because, you know, he thinks that's going to solve things or he wants to dominate the galaxy. He's just trying to make money. So he's also a morally gray character in that story. So I would caution writers to not confuse those two layers of story versus character when it comes to discussing morally gray or black and white, because you get those two muddled, and you know, suddenly you're thinking, well, if I'm having a black and white story, I have to have black and white characters, and then you wind up with a very simple story that's not that interesting. So watch out for that. Oh, and I was gonna talk about something. Oh, and so, and then staying in the Star Wars universe, now you can go to, what am I being notified of in Windows 10? What is by email. I haven't had Windows 10 on my desktop. All of a sudden now I'm getting notifications that I need to find and turn off. Holy smokes. Haha. Yeah, looks like all of my Microsoft email notifications are suddenly starting to come through. Anyway, so staying in the Star Wars universe, now you have The Mandalorian. If you haven't seen The Mandalorian, I highly recommend it on Disney Plus. If you can catch it any other way and you don't want to pay for Disney Plus, do it. It is well worth the watch. So now you have a morally gray story in a universe that's normally very black and white. And you have a morally gray character. Mando is he's not quite like Boba Fett, but very similar in concept, that he has a job to do. He doesn't necessarily care where that job takes him or what that job drives him to do. He has an income to make. He has to make a living. So you have a very morally gray character and story, which is very complicated and also very good. And I think that if you tried to put Mando in a black and white story, it wouldn't work if he were the main character. It wouldn't work at all. And if you tried to make Mando a very black or very white character as far as morals go in this morally gray story of The Mandalorian, it also wouldn't work. If he was the evil character, the villain, the big neon sign that says, hey, I'm evil, you wouldn't have a story. He wouldn't have done what he did to create the story of The Mandalorian. And if he was very good, if he was this perfect hero, we never would have had a story to start with, because he wouldn't have taken the job and it just wouldn't happen. He probably never would have been a bounty hunter. So when you say that you want to do black and white story or or morally gray story, it is also going to depend on the story. Are you writing a fairy tale? If you're writing a fairy tale, you're going to probably have a very black and white story with very black and white characters. But fairy tales don't sell that well, right? And they also aren't usually that long. Have you ever seen a series of fairy tales? Usually fairy tales are short stories in a collection, or short stories, mixed up within larger ones. You don't usually have, I don't have 1,000-page fairy tale novel back here, not a one. And I've got 1,000 books in my library. Not a single one of them is a black and white fairy tale with black and white characters. So when you're deciding what to do with your story, or how to write it, how complex to write it, remember that you've got different layers to work with. But also remember that writing the two-dimensional characters, the black and white characters, is challenging. And I would argue that they're almost virtually non-existent. Just like I would challenge you to tell me if you've ever seen a memorable or good villain who was perfectly evil, never had any purpose for being the way he is except that he's evil. If you can provide me a good one, do it, but I doubt you can. Same thing with a hero. I guarantee you, if you can present to me the perfect paladin who's never made any mistakes in a popular movie or video game, or show it to me, and I'll bet you we can find his flaws. I just don't think they exist as interesting or long-standing characters that we remember, because they're not interesting. Even Superman has his faults. Even Captain America has his faults. If they didn't, they wouldn't be interesting. So make sure you don't fall into that trap of, I want to stick with this. Here comes this trend of writing black and white stories and not morally gray stories, because, we need more black and white stories. No, I don't think we do. I genuinely do not think that it's possible to write a good, completely black and white story with black and white characters. I think it's going to be the most boring piece of work that you've ever seen. And present it to me if you think it exists. I don't think it exists. I don't think there's a good one out there that isn't maybe a fairy tale or a Disney show, which I would argue most of them aren't that interesting either. But if you got one, show me. Let me know. Let me see it. If you have any questions about this, I know this was part lesson, part rant, but hopefully you got something out of this. If you didn't get anything out of this, let me know in the comments. Let me know if there are other topics I can cover. I have a couple suggestions from other people, but in the event that you want to hear something else, or there's a topic that you're really not hearing covered about writing, or the business of writing, or marketing, or process, or anything, let me know. Drop it in the comments. Hit me up on Twitter. Let me know what you want to hear, and I'll do a show about it. So that's it for this show. Again, if you're watching the live stream, thank you so much. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let other people know these little shows are out there. Any of these shows. It's the only way we get seen in Amazon's algorithms. If you have more questions, drop them in the comments. Check out thebeardstruggle.com. Remember, BeardWizard99 is your coupon code to save 15% there. And check out my other shows. I will be bringing Saturday Randomness back, hopefully this weekend. Probably playing some Guild Wars, but we'll see what else pops up. And hopefully I see you guys soon. It was great to talk to you again. And let me know if you have any questions. I will see you next time. Much love.